Thank you very much, Leah, for having me here. And I guess without further ado, I just start my presentation because I have to actually teach at two. So let me start sharing. Um, yeah, so I hope that I will not take a lot of your time because we all have other commitments and if there was any other kind of class, I guess I'd stay. But this is the last class of the module, so I definitely have to attend it. Just one thing to say as a matter of introduction is that this presentation is mostly kind of theoretical paper, and it's also part of a forthcoming book that I'm currently writing. And it's the first time I present the argument in such an elaborate manner, right? So comments are very much welcome, although perhaps we'll have little time for the talk after the presentation, but maybe you can hit me an email. So in general, this work is about a kind of study of the political instrumentalization of public feelings through legal tools, which looks at how manipulative relationships are established between the government and the citizens and how they work, how they are falsified, right? In my current research, I generated this statistical calculations about violence against LGBT people in Russia 3 years before and 3 years after the introduction of the notorious gay propaganda law. I'm sure you've heard about it. It was enacted in 2013. I collected narratives of about the episodes of violence against queers in Russia for these 7 years, right, from 2010 to 2016. And my source was Criminal Court Archive. So this graph represents my findings, and as you see, violence against LGBT people started to grow in 2013 when the bill banning propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships, as it was officially called, was adopted by the Russian legislature and signed into law. So the bill is a censorship law. It's not directly cited in these violence cases, so there is no formal connection between the law and this violence. Now, the number of queer victims still grew after the introduction of this law, and it actually doubled by 2015 as compared to the pre-propaganda times, right? Yet in 2016, the numbers started to decrease. And of course, many explanations can be given as to why precisely this dynamic occurred. For example, it's no surprise to law and emotions scholars or affect theory literature that when politicians disseminate hate during electoral campaigns, many people react to hate speech with violence. And Sarah Ahmed's work is fundamental for this kind of argument. She showed the exact mechanism of how political rhetoric directly translates into violence against various disadvantaged populations in the United States, for example. Other authors soon followed. And what is most interesting in this literature is that it treats emotions that are put into circulation as by these bigots among politicians as the mechanism of power, right? Or mechanism of power relations. So indeed, the criminal court decisions that I reviewed contained a lot of emotions, clearly put into circulation through the discussion of the gay propaganda bill. And some of the emotional accounts given by perpetrators shockingly mirrored ideas widely spread on the Russian state TV. However, emotions are, as reported in these criminal court decisions, were actually of a much wider range than Ahmed and others would suggest, right? So what is called the mechanism of power relations in the political economy of emotions or political economy of affects proved to be of sort of limited help in my analysis. And indeed, I'm more interested in the circulation of affections in society and the products, right, of this circulation, including violence as a product of this circulation. And this theory explains many things here in this particular respect. In particular, it allows an analysis of how various emotions, in Sarah Ahmed's terms, stick to different bodies in political environment that fuels their distribution around. This sticking is the mechanism of power. And moreover, when having those different affects sticking, the process of trading and exchange is enacted. When the feelings of citizens' security is exchanged for political support and consequently for other commodities, I don't know, legitimacy or competences, funds, and so on and so forth. But how exactly, my question is, that circulation occurs, right? I think this is a much more critical question than the one about mechanisms of stickiness of certain emotions. Why? Well, because of this. In the talk about power relations, which affect theory is, it is the question of the panopticon, right? No doubt, all approaches I've been reviewing so far, as well as my own work in general, is analysis of power relations along the lines of Foucault's theory of power. And therefore, all these approaches contribute into the discussion of how we are disciplined via affectionate touch, affects sticking to us, right? While we are submerged to the panopticon like relations of power. And in Discipline and Punish, Foucault theorizes the panopticon as indeed a mechanism of power rather than its technique. But regardless of this, I argue that the panopticon is actually power technique, the technique of power. In fact, in his usual manner, Foucault is very much inconsistent in his use of concepts until they start to really matter for his thinking. The distinction between techniques and mechanisms comes very late, somewhere during the writing of the history of sexuality. So Foucault is mostly interested in the term technique to figure out the ways in which we can avoid the effects of disciplinary power. And he calls it the care of the self, as you remember, a technique of analysis of power relations that may show how not to be caught neither by subjection nor by resistance, yeah, which are two processes of power relations. And the care of the self is a sort of third way, an escape from both. As a technique of power, it is about knowledge, one's definition of the truth, and means of deconstructive analysis of the truth, right? So, while discussing the term technique along the pages of 4 volumes of the history of sexuality, Foucault makes clear that techniques are any particular ways in which power is applied. And a mechanism is how power works, right? This stickiness thing, for example, how power works to achieve effects. Meanwhile, a technique is a means by which power is being applied. So he gives some examples here, right? From techniques of dream analysis by ancient Greeks to techniques of religious confession to finally the panopticon, right? In modern Europe, prisons, schools, barracks, factories, workshops, and so on and so forth, these kind of things. And these are current to Foucault techniques of power as different from power mechanisms. So the metaphor of the panopticon is very physical, and it very well corresponds to the physical world of the European modernity, But my problem with it is that it's too outdated, maybe for the world in which truths are produced more and more in an ever-growing domain of the digital, non-physical world. And hence, for me, the panopticon is indeed a working metaphor of power relations and techniques of power, but of the past, right? And my questions are rather, how does power circulate and shape our bodies today, right? How does the invisible eye of the guard in the central tower of that panopticon look in a situation of inviting disciplinary powers upon ourselves in neither public nor private domain of the digital world? And how is truth kind of produced when information is shared through instantaneous connectivity to many unknown to us people, right? How does this all work in this situation? And I think in thinking about it, I came across mimetics, right? A theory of dissemination of ideas. In 1976, Richard Dawkins coined the term meme to refer to basically any piece of information. And according to Dawkins, information strives to survive by reproduction. And only the catchy pieces of information survive. So this theory is not widely used outside of mimetics or genetics, where it's also used, even though the word meme itself is part of our kind of colloquial language uh, with a relatively accurate meaning, actually. So in legal analysis here, mimetic is somewhat in use to trace the development of legal concepts, right? It's no secret that many legal terms, for example, or concepts we now use come from Roman Empire and from the Roman law, right? And which Roman law concepts have been known to us since the early Roman Empire is something that people can discover with mimetics. This is not what I'm doing, right? And I'm interested in techniques of power relations and in mimetics as techniques of power relations. So in my approach, legal memes are can not are any pieces of information, not necessarily legal concepts. Rather, legal memes are pieces of information embraced and enhanced by law or by law's institutionalized power. So whether or not these memes come from, I don't know, Romans of the 2nd century BC doesn't matter, right? Where, in fact, these legal memes may be as young as few decades, or several years even, right? The question is, what role does the law play in these memes' survival? My interest in mimetics lies with Elliot Borenstein's interpretation of memes in his writings, and most prominently in this work, Plots Against Russia. I see a lot of similarities between techniques of political economy of violent affections outlined earlier and this spread of conspiracy theories that Borenstein analyzes. Essentially, both are threatening messages, implying kind of potentially disastrous societal consequences. And these messages are spread publicly to touch people, to stick to people, and to produce conflicting parties with neatly distributed blame and vulnerability, right? And both play out to amass legitimacy of those uh, who promise to protect the alleged vulnerable population and encourage vigilantism on the part of the kind of these threatened communities. So both may result in violence, and both change their forms with time. And this change, kind of with this change, they adapt. Yeah, these information these pieces of information adapt to dynamic circumstances to ensure resonances. According to this theory, various pieces of information may possess various degrees of catchiness, right? Here are some of the features of memes that I'm mostly interested in. And some of them have less chances to remain replicated unless they mutate to a form that resonates. Hence, reproduction and adaptive transformation are crucial for the meme's survival. If we think of memes as silly pictures on the internet, we see how some of those memes pop up every now and then on different platforms. Others transform and have only moderate success. Most importantly, memes do not seem to require any particular original source in order to circulate, as if they move around by themselves, right? So, as Borenstein puts it, apparently memes circulate a quote, in the absence of any real agency at all, right? So, certainly memes can mean many different things to different people, but in general, they are supposed to hint at only particular meanings by bringing an entire big idea behind a small, catchy phrase. So I propose to understand the power technique of circulation of violent affections as this kind of lifespan of memes. Various pieces of information that may or may not trigger violence and violent affections are spread publicly only to be taken further if proved successful, or wait for their momentum if not, right? Meanwhile, transforming themselves to become more resonant, actively searching a form that resonates. But once they turn out catchy, their reach is hardly under anyone's control. They're not top down kind of sovereign technique of power. They are this disciplinary power, micropower. Their only purpose is to continue circulating by all means. Changing forms, adapting, transforming, igniting responses to deliver this larger narrative behind them to those susceptible to listening their messages. And let me show how it works by reviewing the lifespan of the meme propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships, right? And its derivatives. So it is the exact phrasing of 2013 gay propaganda law. And I will begin this analysis of the memes apparent with the memes apparent content, right? What is it actually trying to say? It consists of three different elements: sexual relationships, this non-traditional part, and propaganda. The first one, sexual relationships, sounds like a perfectly neutral concept meant to signify an intimate association of relatively stable character as opposed to, say, a short encounter for sex. Its implied stability suggests that the phrase refers to sort of orientation, right, rather than just an act of sex. It is about relationship, not just a brief affair. So importantly, sexual relationships is a euphemism for something considered inappropriate to spell out publicly, right? So it's an attempt to hide queerness behind presumed neutrality of the phrase. But queerness, of course, still signals through the second element of the phrase, the adjective non-traditional. Non-traditional certainly is a very rich um, uh, rich thing, rich word, rich adjective, right, in itself. And I will highlight only a few facets of it. But to begin with, nowadays you can actually refer to traditional sexual relationships to signify heterosexuality, but the non-traditional ones, of course, came first. and they were the entire purpose of creating the phrase in the first place. Somewhat paradoxically, actually, these traditional sexual relationships are only a derivative of non-traditional ones, and yet the non-traditional still signifies the novelty of the said relationships, like something that did not exist, and now here we go, it's out there, right? It enacts, of course, a certain version of the past that now has kind of no history of queerness, falsely so, but still it does so, right? So it's working as is this. Implicitly, it works not only with time, not only with the past, but also with the space too, since there was illusionary past without queerness. Someone must have brought it here from the outside, right? So non-traditional also suggests kind of foreignness to said sexual relationships, and altogether this implies that there is this lost purity of sorts, that state of the past which was free from this new object, kind of penetrating from the outside and with so far unclear reasons. And the last element of the meme, the propaganda part, uh, adds clear political reason to the phrase. So propaganda is meant to explain the purpose of bringing this sexual relationships that have had no place in Russia before, you know, it was brought to the Russia's kind of innocent soil. It is to convince people to switch sides, right? Since propaganda is the spread of information for recruitment purposes, it is by now clear that those who have cluelessly had these traditional sexual relationships are being convinced in exploring non-traditional ones. And hence, what the entire phrase communicates is that there is this hostile information threat that is coming from the outside and works to corrupt the population and the people's kind of basic instinct, right? So let me trace the trajectory and modifications of the meme propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships to show why it has proved so successful at the end. And I think in great part it is due to the law that the meme proved so replicable, so catchy, uh, kind of proved its stickiness, right? Within the Soviet political and legal discourse, the phrase "this meme" could hardly gain its moment because Soviet ideology was rather hostile to traditions, and the Soviet law actively fought against traditions as so-called vestiges of the past that held the society back from its inevitable progress to communism. So the meme appears only after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In one vague account, witnessed that the term non-traditional sexual orientation firstly was used to refer to homosexuality in kind of everyday language, maybe somewhere by the end of 1980s, but definitely in the beginning of the 1990s, when the Soviet state already collapsed. Importantly, though, whenever the meme originates, it picked up its pace in the 1990s and now in the beginning of 2000s. So, uh, kind of an example from academic literature describing what can be referred to as Russian queer tradition. Dan Healy, in his seminal book Remarks, book published in 2001, I quote, so the history of modern ideas of homosexuality is tied to a plethora of forms of what Russians currently call, without irony, non-traditional sex, right? So in 2001, it's like already there in the colloquial everyday language, and everybody knows it, even people coming from the outside to research the situation. And indeed, this popular psychological literature commonly uses non-traditional as an adjective that delineates heterosexuality from homosexuality. For example, in a 2009 book, Practical Psychology for Girls, or How to Deal with Yourself and the Boys, published by a major editorial with big run, an entire chapter was entitled Non-Traditional Sexual Relationships, right? So what this brief account kind of demonstrates is the availability of the meme non-traditional sexual relationships and its mutants in discourse that, given memes are kind of thriving to replication, may lead to its resonance across various contexts, including the legal ones. And I argue that this is exactly what happened after the decriminalization of male homosexuality in 1993, when the legal vocabulary kind of required a new term to deal with queerness without necessarily citing its partly lost criminal connotations. So in the Soviet jurisprudence, we had this codified term for homosexuality, buggery, yeah, мужеложство, and it captured both forced and voluntary intercourse. Now, in the new Russian criminal code, when buggery was decriminalized, this term remained only to apply to same sex rape. Now, it means that conditions for making linguistic change or difference, right, between forced and voluntary homosexuality emerged. And hence, non traditional sexual relationships and its variants were kind of presented with a great opportunity to prove effective as legal terminology. And indeed, by the beginning of 2000s, the non-traditional sexual orientation, relationships, love, little derivatives, little variants of this phrase is intensively used in legal context to refer to homosexuality, as evidenced from media reports on court cases and from law enforcement practices. So the propaganda element now of this meme, it uncovered itself relatively independently from the non-traditional sexuality part, and but at the same time it relates to it. Discussions of recriminalization of voluntary same-sex intercourse were going on. They haunted Russian legislator for years, but this chapter can seem to be closed, right? The government rejected all attempts of recriminalization of homosexuality as illogical. For example, even in 2002. So propaganda of queerness emerged as a kind of alternative. You have to criminalize something. Let's try to criminalize propaganda. And this new turn of the debate suggested that even though same-sex relations as such are legal, still, spreading information about them victimizes children who are by default heterosexual, but due to susceptibility of their mind, may easily consider becoming gay under the influence of this propaganda. So the initiatives did not want to criminalize homosexuality as such, but this propaganda. But in 2003, 2009, they still didn't stand their trial, were rejected. During this initial period, the legislators used the term propaganda of homosexuality, and they wanted to include it in the criminal code, but already commented on it in the media as propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships, for example, in 2007. By then, it was a common term, especially its form like non-traditional sexual orientation in law enforcement practice, waiting to go viral to the wider populations and publics. The thing is that even without specific law banning such propaganda, prosecutors, the police, state officials, they still used some other pieces of legislation to restrict free dissemination of information about queerness. So this was already going on. And then country's highest court of law, the Constitutional Court, proved crucial in enhancing the meme propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships with its institutional powers that ensured its survival and proliferation. First, in 2006 Constitutional Court decision on same-sex marriage, the rejection of homosexuality as pertaining to Russian traditions was established. And second, in 2010, Constitutional Court ruling on early regional attempts of banning propaganda, judges merged propaganda and non-traditional marital relationship in the same sentence. The word marital stood for sexual, implying that sex can be performed only within a marriage, right? So the authority of the court served as a proper gate for the meme to go viral. When the federal legislature returned to the idea of banning propaganda in 2013, it simply adopted the court's definition of such propaganda, modifying the meme's form to sexual relationships rather than marital relationships, and finally codifying this whole structure in the Code of Administrative Offenses. The trajectory of the meme non-traditional sexual relationships is a story of a huge success, but it's also a story of its own demise. And its drive for reproduction during this kind of process of reproduction, the meme built an exceptional career, and from being kind of shameful referral to queerness in common speech to acting as a term in popular psychology, in law enforcement practices, to finally getting to the highest courts in the country and to its federal legislature. Yet, in result, it actually returned to where it was. It is now an official legal term to be used in everyday practice of the application of the propaganda law by legal professionals who can casually review a bunch of highly peculiar cases of paranoid propaganda. So if anything, the meme kind of restored its previous position after exhausting its capacity to reproduce. Most probably, it even diminished its status, as it is now just a legal term to be used within the confinements of the legal field, of the legal institution, by legal professionals. Certainly, it did its dark job on the way, but let me first kind of register the meme's fall, and it will be my last argument. So the popularity of the meme non-traditional sexual relationships and its variations peaks in 2013, certainly, when the federal legislature debates about the propaganda bill. I'm further using my database of violence against queers to track the meme's frequency in legal context outside of the propaganda law application. And I also use another database of violence composed of media reports on such violent incidents. This media articles database contains all identified media publications related to attacks on queer from 11 to 2016. Right, so here's a graph from the media database. This graph shows that the term non-traditional went viral in 2013 in media publications, even non-related to the propaganda law. Although these articles are not reporting on propaganda law, their authors still start using the term more actively. Their enthusiasm deteriorates thereafter. Yeah, the trend line demonstrates that journalists and editors start to prefer other terms, not the meme that I'm talking about, right, in the aftermath of the 2013 propaganda law. And this information is from more than 5,000 articles media, in newspapers all across Russia, right? Now, the next graph represents results of content analysis of court decisions on anti-queer violence. And the share of criminal case files with the term constitutes from 81 to 94% in different years, which means that non-traditional sexual relationships and derivatives has always been a preferred term to refer to queerness in the courtroom, in legal settings. As the trend line also demonstrates, despite different fluctuations of the share of the term in overall cases, its usage grows over time. This means that after the introduction of the term non-traditional sexual relationships to the text of statutory law, even though it was just the Code of Administrative Offenses, but still, its use that has been already quite usual in legal practice became even more common, right? So add to this the implementation of the propaganda law itself that only grew in numbers throughout time, and you get in some that queer sexualities in law are referred to as non-traditional when alleged propaganda is under consideration, and even in unrelated to propaganda law cases, right? So what does it all mean to conclude? This comparison of media and legal contexts demonstrates two important things for my study, I think. First of all, it does show that the meme that I understand as a vessel delivering violent affections to susceptible bodies, to susceptible people, indeed widely spread at the time of adoption of the propaganda law. It indicates that if the meme could deliver its message to as many people as possible, it had the best chances of so doing in the precise period around 2013 and somewhat thereafter, but not for too long. Secondly, the comparison also shows that the lifespan of the meme has passed its high point, and that this demise is due to its codification in law. So if you remember this graph I showed in the very beginning, uh, um, it shows a kind of decrease, right, of the number of attacks after two post-propaganda years. Um, and when violence continuously grew, right? So I interpret this growth and subsequent decline as workings of the meme, the propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships, in delivering its message and touching people in various numbers, but subsequently then exhausting its capacity to reproduce with speed outside of the legal field. The less people it reaches out, the less violence there is. So I also propose to attribute the demise of the meme to its narrower applicability after the adoption of the propaganda bill, as it became an official legal term, in other words, right? Uh, and now it's kind of reinforced more and more as such. It found itself in a kind of trap of the legal field. Once someone decides to use it to reproduce the meme, right? That someone offers already a kind of more specific interpretation, a legal interpretation of this phrase than before it became the law. And so therefore may just refrain from so doing. Although the meme is still quite popular, its capacity to reproduce clearly fell down dramatically. So considering its impact on some people's violent affections, I think it's a good news.